we are thrilled again to have Democrat Steve Maviglio and from Forza Communications and Republican Rob Stuztman from Stuztman Public Affairs on board to educate us on the ins and outs of the ballot measures on our upcoming election. Steve is a Democrat, and he's a Democratic political strategist, repeatedly named in Capital Weekly as one of the state's most influential campaign strategists. He specializes in public affairs strategy for the progressive political campaigns and clients, including AT&T, Blue Shield, and the American Beverage Association. Before starting his own firm, Steve was deputy chief staff for 3 history-making assembly speakers. And before that, joining the legislature, Steve was a press secretary for Governor Gray Davis. Steve's political career began in New Hampshire, where he was a 3-term member of the New Hampshire House and worked on numerous presidential, state, and local campaigns. As founder and president of Stuztman Public Affairs, Rob specializes on campaigns, communications, crisis management, and award-winning political advertising. He was deputy chief of staff for communications to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, where he oversaw press, speech, writing, and public appearances. He also served as co-communications director in the historic California recall of 2003 that placed Schwarzenegger in office. He also served as communications director for the California Department of Justice and Attorney General's office. They will both be giving us some great insights into how to interpret the claims of the upcoming ballot measures so that we can make the best personal choices. So Steve, why don't you take it away from here?
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Appreciate this. I think it was about 8 years ago, my mom was on the forum committee and asked me if I would do this one time, and didn't realize it'd be a decade-long commitment, but I appreciate the opportunity to do that. Glad to be back and glad you're still using our old photos to make us both look young again. Especially pleased to be here with Rob. You might think that Republicans and Democrats never talk to each other, but Rob and I go way back. We have a great friendship, and we're glad to be here to talk to you on these issues. Full disclosure, we're both working on some of the initiatives this year. I think it'll be pretty clear when we get to them which ones we're super passionate about, but we'll let you know just to be sure. We want to give you some balanced information, and we'll try to be as much possible to be balanced when we do those. Rob, you want to say a few words and then we'll get started?
Well, Justin, thank you for having me back. It's good to be able to share this time again with Renaissance, and good to be with my old friend Steve. And I agree, I too am grateful for using those old photos. That's why we don't update them.
All right, so let's dive in. We have less to talk about than in years past, and we're doing this a little bit earlier. The election is, I think, 53 days away, which means you'll get your ballot in 23 days. Everybody's getting a mail-in ballot. So let's dig deep and see what we have on your ballot this year. Next slide, please. First, a little bit about why we're looking at what we're looking at. You will notice fewer measures this year. It's the lowest number since 1916, as a matter of fact. A couple of reasons for that. First of all, this is a non-presidential year. Typically, the interests that put measures on the ballot believe they'll have better luck doing it by a vote of the people than through the legislature. And off years, not as many Democrats vote. So that's probably why there's less on the ballot this year. Another reason is that a couple of them were actually removed. They were headed to the ballot, and the legislature, under a provision that was added a few years ago to law, allows everybody involved with them to sort of settle their differences before they actually reach the ballot. And there was 2 major ones that probably would have run up a lot of advertising dollars and confused you in big ways. One was on plastics pollution, and on that score, the legislature passed legislation to address that. And also another one on medical malpractice awards. The doctors and trial lawyers were about to swing it out again on the ballot, but they settled this year, and the compromise was a good thing. So actually the initiative process forced things to get done. So that's a good thing. We're 7 on the ballot this year. We'll talk about in a second how they got there. Moreover, there's 4 already qualify for 2024. I think 2024 is going to be at least double what we're seeing this year. So at least we're spared from those ads for another couple of years. That said, despite the fewer numbers, the money being spent so far has broken records, driven largely by the two gaming initiatives, and Rob will talk a lot about those and why in a bit. But that's just something to remember. It hasn't gotten any cheaper to get anything passed. It's always easier to defeat something than to pass something. The amount of money being spent is beyond obscene sometimes, but when you have a no campaign, it's very easy to find something in a long ballot measure to harp on and attack. And I think you're going to see a lot of that the next few weeks. So let's move on to the next slide. Here's how things got here. One was through the legislature. The legislature put on something, which is Proposition 1, and Rob can talk about that in a second about actually how it got there, and it has that number. One other measure is a referendum on something that passed. That was a bill that the legislature passed and was signed into law, and entities have the ability to put a freeze on that law until the voters approve of it. It's a costly process. You don't see it too much, but we have one instance of that this year, and we'll talk about that. And then we have 5 measures that got there the traditional way. Traditional being these, quote, citizen initiatives are put on the ballot largely by special interests who pay people to stand outside your Target and your Walmart and get your signature and force things on the ballot. This year, the cost to get a signature were exceedingly high because of COVID and some other situations. Rob, correct me, but I heard $10 to $12 per signature was not extraordinary for some of these measures.
That's right.
So that goes to show you how much money is involved just to get something on the ballot. Okay, so let's start with Prop 1. Rob, just want to explain why it's Prop 1?
Yeah, happy to. So this is the proposition that the legislature itself put on the ballot, and it's on the ballot because it amends the state constitution. Any constitutional amendment requires a 2/3 vote in the legislature, but also has to go before the voters. So after the Dobbs decision, there was a lot of discussion. Well, how does this affect California? The California Supreme Court has previously found that in the state constitution, there is a right to abortion under a privacy theory, similar to the theory that was under Roe in the federal constitution. So what the legislature, the supermajority Democrats, obviously, in the legislature have done here is they are in essence codifying what that state Supreme Court ruling has been of some years ago, with literally amending the Constitution. Now, when the legislature puts a matter on the ballot, they have the full ability to provide even the number and the title and summary. So usually, like on the citizens initiatives, the title and summary is prepared by the Attorney General. The number is determined by the Secretary of State, usually assigned in succession of when a measure qualifies with signatures. But the legislature can trump that entire process, as they did here. They have made this Proposition 1 for the purpose of making sure it appears first on the ballot. And so that's what this is here.
Yeah. Now there are some cynics that say, well, the Democrats put this on the ballot to drive up turnout in the wake of the Supreme Court decision. It may or may not be true, but we are seeing this in other states as well. But this one is ours, and it's very specific to the California Constitution. Essentially, it's 2 sentences. The first one there is the key one, and you can see it in front of you. That's essentially what Proposition 1 would write into the California Constitution. Next slide. So Rob, I'll take the yes and you can do the no.
Sounds good.
Okay. So the reason is pretty simple. The proponents believe that we need this written into the Constitution because now some of our state laws might be vulnerable to overturn in the future or now, or something the federal government might do. They point out that there's a number of other states that have this written into their Constitution. Many people say, but hey, you got all these Democrats in the legislature. The laws aren't going to change. Nobody can overturn these things. Well, the legislatures who put this on, which is the president of the state senate, who's a Democrat, Tony Atkins, and the speaker of the assembly, Anthony Rendon, believe it actually strengthens what we already have on the books. So they moved very quickly. It passed the legislature overwhelmingly and went to the ballot almost right before the deadline, one of the last few days before they got it in. And we'll talk about a little bit back and forth on that in a second, but we'll let Rob give you the no argument.
So opponents would argue that it's unnecessary, given the fact that, as I already described, there is a recognized constitutional right that is protected under a California State Supreme Court decision. And unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, there doesn't appear to be any difference coming in the makeup of a Democrat, now almost fully appointed Democrat state Supreme Court. Just one Republican appointed justice remains, appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger. There's also concern of opponents that the language becomes it goes too far and is too broad, in that it could allow for abortion even beyond what's statutorily legal in California. For instance, late-term abortion is not legal in California. You'll hear some arguments against this, that it could actually make it constitutionally a right to those late-term abortions. And as we have seen abortion debated nationally since the Dobbs decision, and we've seen a lot of polling, what we know is that, you know, what most Americans want is something a little bit nuanced and in the middle. They're certainly pro-choice, but want certain limitations. So you'll hear some arguments that this may threaten some limitations that actually would have popular support.
Yeah, there's even been some voices on the pro-choice side that says it could put these rights at risk in the future, because a future court might have a different view than the current court about these, and then they would be overturned. It's a small voice, but it's out there, so I just wanted to mention it. Next slide. So this is widely supported by the California Democratic Party, the legislature. I think it'll probably get the endorsement of most newspapers in the state. The governor has been extremely active in supporting of this. You might have heard he's done a few things on the campaign trail, and as a governor to protect abortion rights. He's fully behind this. The major funder for it is Planned Parenthood and a group called NARAL. And you'll probably see lots of other money coming in for it. The Indian tribes the other day put a couple $1 million into behind it, and it was led by the lieutenant governor in doing that. On the no side, Rob, let's take yours.
Yeah, again, predictable, what you would think. California Republican Party officially opposes. The Catholic Conference of California will be the primary instigator of an opposition campaign. And then there is some more conservative media, which the San Diego Tribune still is at times, that have come out opposed to it.
Okay. All right, thanks. Let's move on to the next one. These are the two, you might want to go back one.
Go back one, yeah.
Yeah. These are the two you've probably seen and heard the most about. I'll let Rob talk about these. He's more knowledgeable than I am on it.
So Proposition 26 was qualified for the ballot really at the beginning of COVID. And just like the recall petition that led to the recall election last year of Governor Newsom, this was also given an extension by a judge for more time to gather signatures. So this has been qualified for some time, and that's why it's the first to appear after Prop 1. The sponsors of this measure were a coalition of Indian gaming tribes, primarily led by the Pechanga tribe in Southern California. And this would legalize sports betting. Sports betting, of course, now can be legal at the state level. There was a federal law that prohibited it, except for in the state of Nevada. State of New Jersey challenged that law, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, I think it was about 4 years ago now, that no, that's not constitutional. States can do this if they choose to. So there's been a proliferation of sports betting throughout the country. We're going to talk in a minute about mobile sports betting. What this would have done was made sports betting legal in California, which you must amend the Constitution to do here, but only at casinos, Indian casinos, and some horse race tracks. So that's primarily what it would do with this new Supreme Court decision. This is how you get the sports betting in California. Very limited, obviously in person, have to be at an actual Indian casino or one of the few remaining horse tracks in California. It also would give those tribes some additional games for their casinos, craps and roulette, which currently they do not have through technicality of law, nuance of law. Would give more money, obviously, to anti-gambling and addiction efforts, prohibits marketing to individuals under 21 years of 21 years of age. But then the last thing there, that provision allowing lawsuits versus non-tribal competitors, that's a big issue, even though it looks like a innocuous bullet point. What this measure also does is allow the tribes a private right, a private attorney general action right. So an ability to sue card rooms. There is a long time dispute, ongoing dispute between the tribes, the gaming tribes, and card rooms as to whether or not the games that are offered in card rooms are indeed legal and operate within the construct of the law. So this is a long time beef, if you will. So as you see now, we'll get to some of the opponents and proponents in a minute, but some of who's opposed to this, running ads against it, are indeed those card rooms that see this as a hostile move by the tribes against them.
Okay, next slide. So the people that are pushing this say, listen, this sports betting, it's sweeping the country. We might as well get it in California, get some money for the state. Well, let's do it in a very regulated way. And those people happen to be the tribes, and their idea of regulation is, let's just allow it on the places we're already allowing betting. Let's just add it to everything else we do. So that's their main argument. The LAO, which is the referee that judges every initiative and how much it'll rake in for the state, said it'll, give us another tens of millions of dollars. Pretty vague number, but it's significant, I think. And also they, will roll out the ads. You have been seeing them talking about allowing the tribes to have self-sufficiency and continue what they've been doing as they've been enabled to do casino gambling at their reservations. They also said it creates a safer environment. You can't have everybody just betting from their bedroom. It has to be in a casino, so there's more ability to regulate and enforce it. Next slide. Rob.
So then the argument against it is that it gives tribes a monopoly on the issue of sports betting. If you're going to add this new betting feature to California, it runs a risk if litigation would be successful of eliminating card rooms. And what's key to that, as you can see in the next bullet there, is that there are a lot of cities where these card rooms are, especially the large ones, that depend on the revenue from those card rooms. $5.5 billion overall is generated by card room activity to local communities in which they exist. So it's a substantial coalition of cities, the unions that have those municipal employees that are opposed to this on the pro card room side, even though it has nothing to do with sports betting. And that's, as I had mentioned when I introed the measure, that's really where the money's coming from, opposed to this.
Okay.
Next slide.
So, the usual supporters, you might think it's the gaming tribes. Then they have some labor support, although most big labor has stayed out of this. And everybody has tried to stay out of this. The tribes are huge political contributors and have very, let's just say, well-heeled lobbyists that do their bidding in the legislature. So people try not to get on their bad side. So you can see the people that are generally on their good side here. On the no side, Rob?
So yeah, no, as mentioned, the card rooms, obviously, there is labor, AFSCME, that's the union that represents more of the municipal employees from those cities that are concerned about losing card room revenue. Proposition 20, well, the state Republican Party, the Democrats stayed neutral. And then some of the opponents on proponents of Prop 27, which is the online mobile gambling operators, which will actually is a nice segue here into Prop 27 for us.
And I put up the Forgotten Felines of Sonoma County, just an example of how coalitions are put together on some of these initiatives that no group can escape. Next slide. Okay, so here's the big one. Rob, take it away.
Yeah, so Proposition 27, this is what you're seeing most of the ads about. So what 27 does, so let me talk about sports betting for a moment. So the first one, 26, is in person at casinos, brick and mortar, or racetracks. But where the real juice is in sports betting is mobile. And that's what you're seeing happen in the states that have adopted it, are allowing people to basically have that sports book on their phone. And the companies that are behind it, if you watch, football, baseball, basketball, you see all the advertising. Companies like FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM Bets, Caesar has an app. Sure, they're into the mobile. They want to do mobile sports betting, but sports betting is really a low margin business in the gambling business. What they ultimately want to get to is mobile betting, period. So, for instance, in states like New Jersey and Connecticut, essentially the mobile betting has become an online handheld casino. You can play online slots, craps, roulette, as well as betting on sports. So to get to the huge California market, some of these corporations, which are huge investor plays, DraftKings is a new SPAC that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange, or maybe the NASDAQ. They decided we need to get to the California market, and they want to own this. They don't want to just be a vendor to tribes. They want to own the entire market. So they've paid the millions of dollars to qualify Prop 27, which would allow for mobile sports betting, just sports betting. That's the kind of the nose under the tent on this. Mobile sports betting. They have used homelessness as the issue that state revenue would go towards. And then a little bit of money also to go to tribes. And there's a condition that they have to work within a tribe in order to sign up to do this. However, the tribe doesn't own or operate the betting. And I should have acknowledged at the beginning, Steve, you could have called me on this, that I am working on this. I am working on the no campaign with some of the Indian tribes against Prop 27. But let's move on to the arguments. Well, more explanation first. So worth going through here. So the LAO, Legislative Analyst's Office, estimates it's about $500 million. 85% to homeless. It's actually 8.5%. It's 85% of the 10% that goes back to the state, goes to homeless funding. LAO estimates that would increase homeless funding by about 3% annually. Some money then goes to gambling addiction, and then 5%, really 1.5%, goes to the tribes that don't have casinos. Which, by the way, non-gaming tribes currently get money from gaming tribes. So 90% of the money stays with the corporations. They have to pay a license fee about $100,000. I'm sorry, $100 million in order to sign up and operate in the state. Well, that's going to limit the competition. There's only so many companies, of course, that can do that. And then it does create a new state agency to enforce illegal gambling, because if they're going to have legal gambling, they want to make sure the government's trying to shut down the existing illegal gambling. Next slide.
So I'll play the pro since you're in the know. So the proponents of this, and if you watch the advertising, you'd be hard pressed to find out this is actually about online gambling, because most of their ads are focused on what the money they would raise from this kind of gambling would go to. And that's a special fund for homelessness. We all know that is the number one issue in the state right now. Just look around Sacramento, you can see the situation. It's out of control, and they say, well, if we have this, dedicate funding more largely for homelessness, that will help tackle this problem. So that's why you're seeing the ads all about this. The other thing it does is provides funds for some non-casino tribes. There are a handful of tribes that are not benefiting from gambling. You've seen them in some of the ads. They say, hey, let's be equal about this. Let's have money go to all the tribes. Again, they talk about, well, if you want to do this, and there's some states where are doing this in a very legal way, it's generating a lot of money. This initiative outlines all the regulations for it, and the enforcement and the funding and gambling addiction. There's all kinds of provisions in there to make sure it's done on the up and up. So if we're going to do it, and we should do it, let's do it this way. I should point out that the reason both of these things are on the ballot is because these interests have been trying desperately to get this through the legislature. The tribes, for the most part, want nothing to do with it because they have a stranglehold on gambling in the state. So the chances of getting this done through the legislature have been next to nothing. And there's a lot of people that say if these things all go down, that will bring people to the table, but we'll see. Rob, do the no side.
Sure. So the with the no campaigns, and there's been two different tribal committees with some varying messages. One of the committees has argued, well, it turns every phone, computer, tablet into a gambling device, and there's some real voter reservation about that in polling. There's been concerns about escalating addiction, also making it easier for youth to have access to gambling. That it hurts tribes. And, what tribes will argue is, look, as I described when I introed the issue, it's really not about sports betting, it's about mobile betting. And if these corporations are able to get to the point where they're offering the online casino, well, then that could threaten the business of these substantial brick and mortar resorts and casinos that tribes have invested in and built throughout the state that have, basically it's how you gamble in California. By the way, you ask, well, why do tribes depend on gambling? Well, they would say you took everything else from us, but the federal government gave gambling as a way for tribes to try to generate revenue and have some self-sufficiency on the reservation lands that have been left to them at this point in American history. They'd argue that if you threaten the overall enterprise of gaming, that's 200,000 jobs and across the state that could have a negative impact on local economies. 90% of the revenues, as I mentioned earlier, I gave away my bias and my talking points earlier. 90% go to the corporations, all of which are out of state, by the way. Doesn't go to the general fund, which is interesting. That gets to one of our opponents here, which we'll talk to in a moment in a couple slides. And that the homelessness funding is just a smokescreen, right? $30 billion in the last 5 years, and things have only gotten worse. Much like some of you may remember the lottery campaign in the 80s when we approved the state lottery with a ballot measure. The tagline was "the kids win too," because all this money was going to education. And yet we've raised taxes how many times over the years and still don't have enough, well-funded education in the state of California. Next slide.
So the proponents are largely the companies that put this on the ballot. They've enlisted some advocates in the homelessness community, including our mayor here in Sacramento, to be on their side. That's a mistake there. I think the major Indian tribes are against this, not for it. The Sacramento Regional Coalition in Homelessness is also a local group that would stand to receive some funds. You'll see some other groups like that in some of the advertising. Obviously, they're in support of it because they would be receiving some funds to attack homelessness from the SM27. Next slide.
Opposition, yes, most tribes are opposed. Over 50 tribes are opposed. There's like 3 that are for it. We suspect they've already, cut their deals with the online operators. Interesting thing here, and you won't see this on any other slide, both the parties agree. Cats and dogs sleeping together. California Republican Party, California Democrat Party, both opposed to this measure. All 4 of the legislative leaders, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, opposed. Teachers associations opposed. I go back to what I alluded to a moment ago. No money for the general fund. Education funding due to Prop 98, the spending formula. Any money that goes to general fund, roughly 43% of that goes to the classrooms. This circumvents the general fund. The teachers don't like that. They think schools should be getting their cut of it. Coalition for Homelessness, San Francisco, there's more homeless groups opposed to this than there are for it. League of Cities is against it, DAs, police officers, and California Senior Advocates League.
Okay. Both of those are not polling particularly well. We'll see what happens despite all that money. Okay, Proposition 28 is a sort of a motherhood and apple pie one. It simply requires that 1% of the money that is received by state school districts goes to arts and music. Typically, they're shortchanged, especially when there's tough budget times. And the proponents of this said, listen, this is integral to a student's education. We got to make sure that they receive arts and music education. Definition is there. There's nothing new that funds it. It's just a dedicated percentage of funding goes to art and music. The arguments are pretty straightforward. It's essentially dedicated funding to make sure that kids get this kind of education. There's some provisions in it to make sure the money is wisely spent and spent in the right places, and it's not just a feel-good kind of thing. And those are the main opposition. Those are the main arguments for it. Rob, you want to do the no?
I mean, arguments against it, and there really isn't much organized opposition, is that it's ballot box budgeting. This is what you hire a governor and legislature to do, and local school districts don't tie their hands. It could require to fund beyond the constitutional requirement for funding schools, which could pull money from other programs. So I mentioned Prop 98. That's what that constitutional requirement is for funding schools. And that 1% would be put in the state constitution. I mean, there's an argument that this is too minute of an issue to put in the Constitution. It should also just be in the statutes.
Yeah. Next. It was put on the ballot by the superintendent of the LA Unified School District, who felt pretty strongly about that. CTA, which is the teachers union, was strongly in favor of it. You've got actors and musicians that you'll probably see in some ads for it. As Rob mentioned, there really literally is no organized opposition. There was not a ballot argument against it in your ballot pamphlet because there's no money being spent additionally through taxes to get it. But nonetheless, there are some no advocates. Go to that slide. And the usual suspects in that category: Harvard Jarvis,
Yeah.
and Carl DeMaio, and actually a newspaper and the Mercury News editorialized against it.
Yeah. More out of the principles of, as we mentioned, on does this really belong in the Constitution? Yeah.
Okay, Prop 29. Yes, I have been talking about this for many years, and it's back again, as Rob's former boss used to say. It lost pretty handily last time. The kidney dialysis company spent heavily to defeat it. It's put on the ballot by a labor union every year. I'm not quite sure what part of no they haven't understood, but they're back again. They've tweaked it. It would change a few regulations to make sure that not just a physician, which was in previous versions, but that nurse practitioners or a physician assistant have to be on site during patient treatment hours. Before, it was just doctors, and the doctors didn't like that idea at all. And there's some more information here in the initiative about requiring more data being sent to the state about what goes on in some of these clinics. Obviously, the clinic operators are not too wild about that. They think everything is fine, but a lot of folks in the unions don't agree with that, and so they've written it into this measure. You can go back there. I'll just tick through those. Can you go back a slide, please? And forward one. So there's a few more provisions added in this year, essentially the same. Little things like posting notice of ownership. It allows for telehealth rather than a physician to be present. They just tweaked it a little bit from what was on the ballot before. Next one. So the labor unions who put this on are sort of on this jihad against the companies, and there's just a handful of them that control this market. Their major argument is that it's going to improve quality care for patients, though you will see most patients in ads against this, oddly enough. This is a very big industry. We're talking billions of dollars here, and the unions believe it needs a little more regulation than the state legislature has enacted through statute. Against it? Rob, you can do that?
Sure. Yeah, the dialysis centers, and again, these ads are going to look just like the ones you've seen now in the last few cycles. Dialysis centers are going to say they're already more highly regulated. It's going to increase healthcare costs. There'll be probably a big message in the ads. It takes professionals out of hospitals, which has a little bit of a different tenor post-COVID, of course. There'll be lack of access in certain communities because of closures of clinics because of these higher costs. I think to the point now where they'll actually just tweak the union and say this is a pressure tactic. This is why you've seen this again and again. And you'll have patients, several of these 80,000 kidney dialysis patients in this state looking in the cameras saying it puts their treatment and therefore their lives at risk.
So the supporters are that labor union I mentioned, SEIU. They have been unable to get this through the legislature, and that's one of the reasons they keep coming back to the ballot. Labor in general, the Labor Federation, which is the coalition of all the public employee and other major labor unions in the state, is also on board with that. And the California Democratic Party, which usually takes a pro-labor position, also is in support.
Opposed to it, of course, are the dialysis companies themselves, which will be funding the opposition campaign. The American Nurses Association, not the California, but the American Nurses Association. Obviously, California Republican Party was opposed. California Medical Association, that of course is the Association of Doctors. They are opposed, but the providers. National Kidney Foundation, which would be the interest group for the patients, is opposed, and the California Senior Advocates League.
Okay, next one is Proposition 30. This is the one I am working on the yes side. This is something that was put on the ballot by environmental groups for the most part. It's being funded in major way by Lyft, the ride sharing company. What it's designed to do is make 20-year funds available separate from the state budget to take on climate action, to make sure that we can meet our goal of having zero emission cars by 2035, and also to put some money towards firefighting. It is funded by a new tax, but unless you have earned $2 million or more, which is a very tiny slice of our population, you won't be affected by the new tax. Typically, millionaires tax poll very well. They think there's enough funding for this to come out of that very small community, and it now enjoys some strong support. There was a poll that came out yesterday that had slightly less support, 55-40, but it's still widely popular, with the belief that the revenue is desperately needed for firefighting wildfires, as we're learning from the mosquito fire, and also to meet our clean air goals. Next slide. The proponents say, listen, we got to put our money where our mouth is. The state talks a lot about doing things on climate, but sometimes when budgets get tough, it's one of the first things to go. This will guarantee funding. It does not go into the big pot with everything else. It's a separate fund that will make sure all these things are funded for the next 20 years until we get to the place we need to be with zero emission vehicles and to continue to fight wildfires. It raises a substantial amount of money. It's $100 billion over the 20 years. Again, it's targeted funding. It has accountability provisions to make sure the money doesn't go elsewhere, and largely will go to helping people with subsidies for low and middle income people to buy electric vehicles, because they are pretty pricey. Prices are going to come down, but this will help it get there. And also for building more charging and fueling stations for electric vehicles and hydrogen vehicles. Anybody who has an electric vehicle know it's sometimes tough in many parts of the state to find one of those stations, and this will make sure that they can be found just about everywhere, making zero emission electric cars a lot more practical. Next slide. Rob?
Yeah,
You're the bad guy.
so and I might add a few more than what's bulleted here. The argument against it is just no new taxes, even though this is additional. It's a tax on very few Californians, but still a tax increase. Ballot box budgeting, as we've talked about before, there's some opposition to that. The state's already well on its way to this type of infrastructure. There's new federal funds available in the act that was just passed through Congress this summer. And this is a special interest to benefit the rideshare company. So let me focus on this for a second. So Lyft primarily funded the ballot qualification, the signatures on this, the rideshare company. And Steve, you might have to help me on the specific regulation, but rideshare companies are under a California mandate that is at 90% by 2030 has to be clean fuel, Steve?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Basically, the Uber and Lyfts of the world have to get cleaner with their rides faster than, frankly, the general population. So what Lyft has been accused of here, and we'll get to this and some of who's opposing this, is that, well, they're doing this in order to fund infrastructure and create incentives for people to have cars in order to meet this mandate that they're under, and therefore they don't have to pay for it. It'd be done with public funds, is essentially the argument that you'll hear about Lyft. Next slide.
So this is interesting in that it's not the usual suspects on both sides. This was on its happy way to approval until a few weeks ago. The California Democratic Party endorsed it almost unanimously. It has the group endorsement of every major health group like the American Lung Association. It has a lot of labor support from the state building trades and the electrical workers, the state firefighters. The union came out strongly against it because they will have a lot of money going to hire more firefighters that we need. And just about every progressive group was out there for this, happily singing along and thinking it was going to sail through, because there really was no organized opposition to a few weeks ago. And then, Rob?
Then one day, Governor Gavin Newsom lashes out at Prop 30, and not subtly. He really called it out hard. Now, the California Democrat Party had already supported it. He's come out hard against it, calling it basically a special interest SOP to Lyft. He goes easy on not naming Lyft, but he goes, it's about a single company, is what he has said. So so just think how odd this slide looks. Opposition is the California Republican Party, Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, Gavin Newsom, and the Teachers Union. And the Teachers Union is probably one of the key reasons that the governor has come out opposed, not just opposed, but he's in an ad this week from this campaign. And a lot of his political team is running this campaign to oppose it. The Teachers Association, I think, is kind of an interesting group to highlight here. So this, again, is a tax increase, but none of that revenue goes general fund and is allowed to go to the classroom. So some point, even the Teachers Association knows there's only so many of these billionaire tax increases we can have before they do leave the state and they're not available to us. And so I think there's a real sense that this is not how to use one of those chits, one of those tax increases on the uber rich. They want it for future consideration. And I think that's what's largely driven the Teachers Association and the governor's calculus on this, and is made from one of the more interesting, fascinating opposed coalitions that we've seen in some time.
Yeah, and to be sure, the No campaign is funded almost exclusively by multimillionaire and billionaire Silicon Valley folks. I think they have something under 20 contributors, some of that put $1 million into this against it. And, the Lyft people are saying, listen, we don't even own these cars. Most of them are owned by low-income people that are doing rideshare because they need extra income. And so shouldn't we get more of these zero emission cars on the road? It doesn't help us so much as a company as it helps these people that would have to buy those cars anyway to keep their employment. So, there's going to be a lot of back and forth and very interesting. The polling is, like I said, showing favorable, but that was before the governor went up on the air and before the yes side put up a single ad of its own, which began running this week. So you'll be reading a lot about this one as I think people move away from the gambling initiatives and on to some of the other ones on the ballot. Okay, we got one more. This is a referendum. So as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the ways to get on the ballot. This is after the governor signs a bill into law. A aggrieved party can literally put it on hold for a couple of years, essentially till the next election, and have the people vote on it. So remember, this is a referendum on the sale of flavored tobacco products. So if you want to ban, you have to vote yes. If you want to uphold the law, if you don't want to uphold the law, you vote no. It's very confusing. The bill was passed in 2020, essentially said that you can't sell flavored tobacco products. As you can see from the graphic there, many of these things have very appealing, sort of kid-friendly packaging and names and flavors. So this was put on the law was passed to try to prohibit some of those. Next. You will find as we go to the support slide, this was largely pushed forward by health groups, anti-tobacco groups who are attacking the tobacco industry as this being the next thing after we banned all kinds of other things from the tobacco companies. They say it's going to lead to better health incomes if people aren't using these products. And they say there'll be some long-term savings for health costs because less people will get ill from using this type of tobacco. I'll let you be the bad guy again, Rob.
Well, the arguments against is that it's government overreach. You know, people should have a right to choose whatever flavored tobacco product they might like. And I've heard adult friends, I don't partake any of these, but I've heard adult friends lament some of what would be banned even from what they have access to. There's also already some federal laws in all of this. I would mention adults being affected by it. $100 million loss of revenue and lack of sales, and that it hurts retailers as well because of the fines that could be imposed upon retailers, often minority-owned small businesses who are selling these types of products.
Yeah. Next slide. Again, nothing surprising here. The California Democratic Party, Kaiser, American Heart, American Cancer, former Mayor Bloomberg, or should I say former presidential candidate Bloomberg, also has put in some money for this, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. And again, nothing unusual here. All the health groups are strongly pushing this and funding it.
And of course, opposed to it is the California Coalition for Fairness, which when he prepared the slide, Steve parenthetically pointed out that's the name of the tobacco company front group. National Association of Tobacco Outlets, that'd be the retailers, and the California Republican Party has taken an opposed position. So one other quick item on this, Steve talked about this being a referendum and that it was the signatures were a couple years ago to referendum this. So what that did was suspend this law for 2 years. And so the thinking is that by investing and collecting those signatures, which probably cost about $7-8 million, maybe $9 million, just suspending the law for 2 years was a return on investment that accrued to the tobacco companies, who I do not believe expect that they're going to win this before the voters. But the referendum did allow them 2 years of reprieve before it would take effect.
Yeah, and we're seeing that with a bill that was just signed into law about fast food workers improving their pay, and it looks like the fast food companies are going to do the same thing with that law. That buys them 2 years of not having to pay higher wages. So, you know, it's a tactic. All right. Well, that concludes our run through, and I think we'll be glad to take your questions.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. As always, you've helped my head from hurting when it comes time to look and try to figure out all these propositions. Hopefully you've helped some other folks with the same thing too. We don't have many questions here, so we should have, since we only have about 5 minutes time to get through them. Just for those of you that are in the room, I'm going to ask a couple of questions from the Zoom audience, and then we'll throw it out to you for any questions you have there, and hopefully we'll get enough in. In reference to the first Proposition 1, if for some reason the feds were to pass a law through Congress, what happens to our laws if we've changed our Constitution to protect abortion rights?
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I was going to say that really is a legal question that Steve and I are probably ultimately not entirely qualified to answer. However, I would point out that the Dobbs decision specifically overturned the law of that was in Roe to allow states to choose. And so if there was a federal ban, if that were ever happen politically, which is hard to see, but if there was, it would seem that would be an issue that would then go back to the court and would really be antithetical to what the legal premise of what the court has ruled under Dobbs.
Okay, that makes sense. So what is a card room and who runs them or owns them?
All yours.
All right, so a card room is what it sounds like. In Sacramento, I think we have 6 or 7 of them in the county, and it's where you can go. You can go play poker. You can play games that resemble 21 and some other card games. And they're licensed. There's a limited number of licenses throughout the state, and those licenses are allocated by the local governments, by the counties that have a quota of them. So the nuances, and this is a nuance that matters, but it gets a little complicated, is they're not like a regular casino in that the house cannot back the games. You're not gambling against the house. You have to be playing against another player. Well, the gray area has been what happens is there's a third-party company that comes in and sits at that table and essentially acts like a house because that's who you're playing against. And this is the issue that tribes have some quarrel with. So if you've ever gone to a local card room and if you like played 21, you're playing against each other because technically you have to deal at some point and be the house. So there's probably more information than we have time for, but that's what they are. They're in the communities. Some of them are kind of dark and small. Some of them are huge. I mean, LA County has some large card rooms that call themselves casinos, even though they don't bank the games, but they are large operations and generate a lot of revenue to local government.
And did you talk about who owns them typically?
Oh, they're owned privately. The licenses, they're a valuable commodity to own and control those licenses, and then they're owned by private companies, operators. Okay. Yeah,
makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Chris, as tech host in the room there, do you have anybody with questions there? You can take a mic to.
We do, right over here.
Hi, Dave Ward. These propositions, as propositions go, seem pretty straightforward and able to decipher. But year after year after year, we get propositions that a no means a yes and a yes means a no. The most recent one, the gas tax, you voted, if you didn't want it, you got it, and vice versa. What kind of effort is put on or is being put on to try to clean that up and make the wording straightforward? It's 2 guys who help on it. I think you would know.
Your turn, Steve.
Gentlemen.
Okay. So efforts made to clarify this. You're on mute, Steve.
Yeah, I said I'm busy answering questions in the chat box. So Rob, can you take that one?
I'll take a look.
Okay.
So the most confusing natures that Steve talked about on the referendum, when there's a referendum, the whole law goes on the ballot. And so the yes and no can become complicated and reversed. I mean, other than that, most of them are pretty straightforward on what you're voting yes to get. And no almost always means status quo, which is why no campaigns are much easier to execute. Because all you have to do is create doubt. If there is confusion, that usually accrues to the benefit of the no campaign, because people are just going to resort back to like, I don't want anything to change. I'm good with status quo. That's what we're seeing happening with the gambling measures, for instance. So there's no legislative effort to try to help clarify these things. It's really what campaigns have to do and what they exist to do. And those that can explain themselves the best usually prevail with the benefit of the majority of the voters.
Just to double check, you said Prop 1 had to be 2/3 to get through the legislature, but all of these are just simple majority, right?
That is correct.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're at the 5-minute point.
The audience here wants to thank you all very much. And yes, a round of applause from the audience, the live audience. If I might, as a former official, I would like to point out that at the beginning of the state ballot pamphlet, they do make a real effort. And I always advise people to read at the beginning of the state ballot pamphlet what a yes vote means and what a no vote means. And I think they do try to clarify that in very, very simple language. So, but thank you both. And thanks, Christy. Oh, one more question. Oh, sorry. Okay, hold on.
Hi there. I have a question about the Proposition 1, and that is, the abortion safeguards. And I had a question about late-term abortions. They're not currently legal in California right now. Is that true? And what would constitute a late-term abortion currently?
Well, late-term abortion is not consistently defined anywhere in law that I'm aware of, but generally it means sometime after viability or third trimester. So I think most people in their minds is like, well, third trimester becomes a later term abortion. In California, they're not legal. There's 39-week abortions not legal in California. Forgive me, I do not know what the exact term is, how far in term, but there's no late term abortions in California. So there is, opponents argue, well, this may allow for that then to happen, not through legislation, but people having a state constitutional right to do it. I believe the proponents make the case that no, they don't think it does expand the current how late in a term you currently are eligible to have access.
Can we take one more question?
Sure.
Okay, we only have 2 minutes.
Yeah, this is a quick one for both of you. With that Proposition 27, do you guys think, what's your opinion? Do you guys think that these FanDuel and Reality King bit off more than they can chew money-wise going against the Indian people?
Well, Steve, you're the unbiased
Yeah.
answer on that. Go ahead.
I think the answer is yes. I think they realized they would have to spend a lot of money, but I think they underestimated the amount of money that the gaming tribes would invest in this particular battle. It's been a lot of money. The tribes have actually, I think it's almost qualified for 2024 again to do something. But I think the FanDuel company said, listen, we're not going to get anything through the legislature because the tribes are so influential there. Let's go to the ballot. Let's make a special fund for homelessness because that's what people care about. And we'll take our chances. And they put a lot of money into it, but despite all the ads, the numbers have not moved on this. And
I think it was they grossly miscalculated, which is astounding considering how much money was at stake. Just some context, there's never been any proposition that has passed that's had $100 million or more spent against it. And that was the first thing we did, was announce we're going to spend $100 million, and we'll end up spending collectively with other tribes more than $100 million. So I would think investors and shareholders of these companies are going to have some questions when this is said and done, but we'll see.
Well, I want to thank you both for another great year of great advice for our audience and our membership. We're all set now to make the right choices, I'm sure, no matter who you are. To thank you both, we are giving honorary memberships to you each for the next 2 semesters, this semester and next semester through the end of the fiscal year. And we are making a monetary donation to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund to help students in need.
thank you. Excellent.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And just to remind everyone, all these forums are recorded and archived. Just go to the Renaissance Society webpage, the homepage, and click on recordings, or you can go to youtube.com and search for the Renaissance Society Forums Committee. Next week, Arlen Orchard was going to give a presentation on the California Mobility Center, but he had an emergency situation come up, so his Next in line, the Chief Executive Officer, Neil Best, will be giving a presentation. Neil will show how the California Mobility Center works together with startups and industry leaders to drive the pace of recovery and support innovation in future mobility. So I thank you for this and have a good evening, and we'll see you next week.